Welcome to week 3 of CCJ 112 patrol procedures. I'm your instructor, Jason Jones, as we consider common patrol assignments and duties. So, patrol. Eventually, nothing will surprise you when it comes to calls for service, many of which leave you shaking your head, knowing that there are so many problems that you cannot solve. That is the dilemma of the patrol officer, remembering what you have control over, which is your attitude, how you see the world, how you see things and people, your efforts, what you choose to do, and how you treat people, meaning the citizens you serve and your coworkers and supervisors and beyond. So, patrol duties vary, right? Some of them come from community members. They could be as a result of some kind of code violation. You might be doing welfare checks, premise checks. Welfare checks tend to be, people that are down, like unchecked or asleep. Maybe somebody passed out. Or a prem check, a building, a park, some location that maybe has suspicious activity or has had some break-ins or other problems. Area checks, maybe you hear some shots. Can't tell if it's fireworks, a backfiring car, or somebody cranking off rounds. And so in those premise checks of buildings, sometimes you respond to alarms that are going off, or somebody passing by and seeing a door or window open or broken. That may require police to go and think, somebody, an intruder may be inside, so we need to clear that. And you're not going to do that by yourself. You're going to have a minimum of 3, oftentimes more than that, depending on the size of the structure. There's certain search protocols you'll follow. You may go with your firearms drawn, depending upon the circumstances, and you may indeed use a canine with a camera affixed to do some of the searching and clearing. Um, Nuisance and hazards. Obviously illegal camping and homelessness continue to be a problem, and it's a growing problem. This is something I spend considerable time thinking about and dealing with in my work. But is it a police issue? Should it be? Certainly, just maybe somebody camped out on the sidewalk or in a park, it might not necessarily be, but it very well could be if they're trespassing and if there's crimes associated with what the person is doing. But is it just illegal to be homeless? The answer is no. Then you see maybe sometimes homeless people engaged in aggressive panhandling. It's a fine line between that, which is protected speech, just regular old panhandling, and somebody perhaps coercing someone to give, which is robbery potentially, or it could be such that it's causing disturbance and alarm of people in the area, which is disorderly conduct. So police officers have to know those nuanced differences. Also, hey, you discover tree limbs that have fallen in storms, utility lines and poles go down because of accidents or storms. Dealing with flooding issues and clogged drains where cars cannot pass by, malfunctioning traffic signals. You have people that are in the area might be suspected of drug dealing or walking the street as a prostitute, sex worker. And so officers get calls from community members all the time to address that, or maybe they see it and spot it and choose to address it as self-initiated activity. Finding people shooting up. Citizens see it all the time in their yards, on their porches, in their cars, and police spot it too. And how about suspicious people? What's a suspicious person? You know what a suspicious person is. If somebody's peering into your car and you go, "Hey, what are you doing?" and they suddenly start walking away as they're stammering, and you're looking at them going, "They're up to no good." That's a suspicious person, right? Prowlers, either car prowlers or burglars, people casing businesses or homes or neighborhoods for potential opportunities to steal. Disruptive youth. Oh, but if you get a group of people together and they're not abiding by the norms and customs and culture of that setting, they're viewed as disruptive, especially if they're viewed as being out of control and not willing to follow, informal social control and the rules. Gang activity. In Portland, we no longer have gangs because we've outlawed the term. That doesn't mean that there aren't gangs, of course, but it restricts our ability to label people as such. That still doesn't mean that there aren't people impacted by gangs, either as members or victims of gangs or family members of gang members, that sort of thing. And so we have to deal with that activity, whether that be shootings or parties that where there's a potential for violence, or the nefarious and illegal activity that goes along with being in a gang. Taggers and graffiti, which could be part of gang activity and marking territory, or it could be just part of that culture, which is in many respects distinct from gang activity. But nonetheless, you see their so-called art and markings on buildings and on bridges and signs and different structures, right? And oftentimes they don't have permission to do that, and so it is considered, damage to property. Parties, loud bars, taverns, and clubs. We get calls all the time to these kinds of things, and have to quiet them down, um, remind them of the noise ordinance, and also just to be good neighbors. Speed racing, something we deal with, and if you haven't traveled on Marine Drive lately, there are now photo uh, like like radar cameras up there and in different areas to deal with that. Chronic speeding through neighborhoods. This is something that we get complaints about. Loitering, people just kind of hanging around, potentially up to no good. Cruising isn't really an issue anymore now that we have smartphones. We know where everybody's at because they're posting it. But it used to be you go to certain areas and cruise. Nobody really does that. It's kind of a 70s and 80s thing. Abandoned, dumped automobiles, illegal dumping. Those are things we have to deal with. People that just, they say, "Hey, I'll clean your yard for you." And you're like, "Man, that's cheap. Wonder how they're able to afford the dump fees and all that." Well, they're not. They're doing it so cheap, and they're just dumping it somewhere illegally. People are always asking the cops what to do, where to go, and how to get to places, including hospitals and shelters and malls and different things like that. And then you get weird questions about the population, elevation, politicians, temperature, rainfall, all kinds of stuff like that. Um, and so, how police patrol really depends on how big of a town you have, how big of a city, how dense it is populated. Uh, outer Northeast Portland has fewer cops than, say, downtown Portland, where you have high rises and buildings and you have more people, right? So that determines how many resources we um, uh, allocate to police. Also, how many cops there are depends on tax revenue and how much money the city or county um, provides its police department to provide services. Geography matters. Hills. Hey, Portland is one of those that has, you know, little mountains in it, that are, some of them are dormant volcanoes. Think Mount Tabor and others. And so geography matters too, as does topography, the hilliness of things, geography with rivers, and just the overall size. Natural resources like the rivers and hills and trees and things like that all matter, which determines if you maybe engage in foot patrol, right? This is something pretty common back in the day, and has resurged in heavily populated areas where the population is concentrated because they can't get around well in cars and other ways. It's just too crowded. If we were in class, we would do this, but so I'll just give you the info here, the advantages and disadvantages of foot patrol, right? Works well in congested areas. You can also get to know people pretty well, and it enables you to solve problems, also spot and prevent crime in those areas. but you can't get around really quickly to cover other officers unless you run, right? So you're limited to your geographical area, and at the end of your shift, your feet and your hips are going to hurt. You also don't have the same kind of tools that you do in a car, like a mobile data computer, the storage of a trunk, in the area to confine a prisoner, and honestly, it can be lonely and sometimes even dangerous if you're patrolling by yourself. Bike patrol was common when cars weren't, and it has resurged. It's kind of fun thing. It's good in populated, congested areas for missions and special events. It's certainly people love to see their cops on bikes, and there's less carbon emissions from that. It's great for as a crowd management tool to use as a fence, and to kind of move people and route people, also to stop people because people are going to be less inclined to run from a bike because you can catch them. Disadvantages, again, distance to cover other officers. You can't transport prisoners. It's not a lot of fun to ride right about now, and it isn't practical in non-concentrated populations where, like Clackamas County, if cover is needed on Mount Hood somewhere and you're coming from 82nd Avenue, bicycle wouldn't be the most advantageous way to get there. So that leaves patrol cars, right? You get quicker response times. You have your office basically in your car with all your equipment. You can transport people to other locations. You can do a lot of stuff, cover greater distances. You have more types of enforcement that you can do, and you're going to stay warm and dry, or in the summer, cool and dry. But we over rely on it. It creates barriers between community and citizens because cops are driving here and there, and they're like, "Hey, officer," but the officer doesn't hear because he's driving 35 miles an hour, playing the brew on the radio. That can lead to laziness. You also have fuel and maintenance costs, and of course, carbon emissions. And officers are going to be more inclined to stay in their cars versus get out of their cars because that's they're there and they can get around, and it's easy to just do that. Um, so then there's some other issues, take home cars versus like driving to work in uniform versus plain clothes. Portland doesn't have take home cars. Clackamas County does. Our cars are constantly in use in Portland. We're not allowed to drive to work in uniform. We have to switch out because if you get in a wreck and a cop gets out of a Subaru, it kind of creates this weird dynamic, right? So you get ready for work at the precinct where you're assigned, the police station, right? You check your equipment, that sort of thing before you go on duty. So, one officer versus two officer patrolling. There's one theory that if an officer goes to a dangerous call or encounters a dangerous situation, they'll automatically have backup dispatched, or they can call for backup, right? Another theory, officers assigned partners are more apt to rush in and use force than if alone. But that doesn't hold water with me because there's this whole notion of safety numbers. Um, I think there's a few advantages of patrolling with just one officer. Certainly, more efficient use of resources. Those cops can take more cold calls and cover greater areas, but you can't divide tasks. You're going to have to do everything. And, honestly, there's the distance and time to get to somewhere to provide cover for another officer. And you're going to avoid, like, you see some gang members out there, you might not want to contact them because you're like, hey, I'm all alone. It's not worth it to me to potentially then have to call for cover and, that kind of thing. More disadvantages. As one constable from Trinidad and Tobago said, one is none, two is one, meaning you got two, you can do a lot more, and you're stronger in a team. There's less officer safety, and you lack strength by yourself. There's the whole notion of numerical superiority. Firefighters don't work alone. Why should police? You're vulnerable when you're alone, and you have contact and cover. So, two officer patrol units during peak hours, that's one compromise. So, like when it's really busy, and you're going to have a lot of hot calls, assign people together, put those two-person cars in high crime areas, And also, if they say, hey, listen, we'll cover 2 districts if you let us work together. I do that all the time as a patrol supervisor. I hope that's helpful. I hope that gives you some insight into how patrol officers work, and we'll talk more about it next week.